Welcome to the Toyota Solutions Studio at Women in the World in 2018 here in New York City. If you don't recognize his face, you recognize his byline. Nicholas Kristof is a two-time Pulitzer Prize winner who has written many books, who has a twice-weekly column in the New York Times. And you have really carved out a niche for yourself, Mr. Kristof, I think in the humanitarian space. You have seen humanitarian crises the world over. What gave you the conviction to carve out that space?
You know, I feel like Don Quixote, tilting at windmills. But I'd say they're all over, and I'm about as successful as Don Quixote in trying to making a difference on a lot of them. But I think it really is a function of that once you have gone out and found a situation where children are being tossed into bonfires, or people are being thrown into wells, or every woman in a village is being raped, then it is hard to leave that and go back to writing about exchange rates or about something more banal that we do about some bill in Congress. It haunts you. And so I come back and I think about what I've seen, and
how
then
do you process it? Because of course you did 4 reporting trips recently to Rohingya refugee camps, one of the very few journalists that have had access, and the writing and the descriptions I have seen are absolutely horrific. How do you process that?
So I think people often think that as a reporter who covers genocide, poverty, must be deeply depressed and suffering from PTSD and kind of the Eeyore of journalists. And the truth is that side by side with the worst of humanity, you invariably find the best. And so you go to the Rohingya villages and sneak in, and you see horrible things, or in Darfur or Congo, wherever it may be. But side by side, you also see these unbelievable people doing extraordinary things, demonstrating the human capacity, not just for evil, which you see, but the human capacity for courage, for strength, for resilience, for generosity. And so I managed to come back and, in a crazy way, kind of feel better about humanity.
Let's talk about those trips to the Rohingya camps. You don't have to go into the detail of the atrocities you saw, but there are hundreds of thousands of these people that basically have no country that seems to really want them. I'm curious where they want to be, where they consider home.
Well, they consider home to be in western Myanmar, in Rakhine State, where
they're not wanted,
where they are not wanted, where their families have lived for generation after generation after generation, and where they have now been deprived of nationality. And I must say that I think we quite rightly denounce Myanmar for its brutality toward the Rohingya. But it's also true that other countries haven't stepped forward at all, either to condemn what is going on or to provide a home themselves. Malaysia and Pakistan have significant numbers of Rohingya refugees. They criticize Myanmar, but they don't do anything for their own Rohingya. And we have under President Trump, we have refused to accept Muslim refugees. It's very hard for us to have the moral authority to tell other countries to accept refugees when we won't accept even a nominal number.
Refugee camps are never happy places, but the atrocities that I've seen described that these people have fled from are particularly jarring. Have you ever, you mentioned Darfur and other crises that you've witnessed firsthand. Have you ever seen anything like this?
It's hard to rank genocides, and I wouldn't want to. I mean, Darfur was horrible. This is horrible. I've seen terrible things in South Sudan and Congo. But what one can say is that, the word evil, it's one of these sort of words. It sounds archaic. It sounds like it doesn't really belong in the 21st century. It belongs to the Old Testament. You go and talk to survivors. You talk to Rohingya women who have seen their male family members killed in front of them, and then on their way, as they were led off to be raped, had their babies grabbed from them and thrown into bonfires. That's evil. I mean, evil still exists, and it feels, it's a strange word, but in places, whether it's Myanmar, Darfur, it survives.
Many of these problems, especially those of refugees, you talk about the lack of acceptance for refugees. There's also the Syrian refugee crisis, which involves hundreds of thousands of people. So we're looking at, the worst refugee crisis since the end of World War II, right? And as such, I think for a lot of people, when they hear it, they feel like these are intractable problems. So as somebody who has really delved into what the problem is, where do you see solutions emerging? And does that come from the United Nations and multilateralism? Does that come from individual governments taking a moral role? Or are we talking about NGOs and grassroots organizations at this point to just try to get people sort of basic security?
So, I mean, there are more problems than in international relations than there are solutions. And there's no magic wand to solve these problems. Having said that, I think that the despair is unwarranted. And there have been times, there's no one solution that's going to fit every context, but in general, for example, I think President Obama is way too passive in the case of Syria, but he was extraordinarily successful in the Mount Sinjar area on the Iraq-Syria border, where he intervened with the Yazidi and averted. I mean, tens of thousands more people would have been slaughtered if it hadn't been for our very successful intervention there. He in Burundi was teetering on the edge of a genocide a couple of years ago, and President Obama taped this little message to the Burundian people with a little message even in the local language, and that genocide did not happen. And so, it must have been hard to convince the White House to do this. There's no simple way to solve everything, but the starting point is to get it on our agenda. And I guess one of the things that disturbs me is that I think we rightly complain that Western countries, including the United States, have not been speaking up about humanitarian crises, and thus they are not addressed. But we in the media, frankly, have also let them slip through the cracks. And if we were to cover them more aggressively, I think that would also put more pressure on the Trump administration, on Britain, on France, on other countries to do more as well. So I hope that I hope the public will hold our governments accountable. I hope they hold us in the media accountable as well.
There has been so much drama in this White House that it seems to dominate so much of cable news coverage, of mainstream news coverage. That seems to speak to the disservice being done to the various crises happening around the globe.
It sucks the oxygen out of coverage of everything else. And one of the larger problems is now that the business model for much of journalism is kind of collapsing. And if you are the executive producer of a TV show, then you can go and send a camera crew to cover what I believe is a genocide against the Rohingya, and it'll be expensive, and it'll be dangerous, and you will lose audience compared to a rival channel that puts a Democrat and a Republican in a studio together and has them yell at each other. Right. And that is the very difficult reality that we're facing.
Yeah, the journalism that you're doing is really a luxury, given that local newspapers can't even survive. What's next for you? What else is sort of keeping you up at night that you feel like you're itching to cover?
South Sudan is a kind of horrifying crisis, a country that the U.S. helped midwife, and that certainly deserves more coverage. I haven't been able to get a visa for a while. My wife and I are also working on a new book about the U.S., about inequality in the U.S., people left behind in the U.S. So we will be also spending rather more time in some backwaters, shall we say, of the U.S.
When I interviewed your wife and yourself a couple years ago, you had written a book, and I'll never forget the basic premise of it, which is that, you know, sort of doing good actually makes you a happier, healthier person. So your work, you know, when you look back at your long career of being and bearing witness to such, you know, horrific parts of humanity, the paradox is it must have filled you, you know, in a way that few of us feel enriched.
Well, it's been incredibly satisfying, and I've been so lucky that the New York Times has given me this license to cover these issues. But I guess I'd also say that, you know, while I've covered a lot of terrible things, I really have seen progress as well, and that is enormously encouraging. You know, I cover a lot of global health issues, and it's so frustrating to see kids dying unnecessarily. But the number of kids dying before the age of 5 each year has dropped by more than half just since 1990. You know, the number of people going blind from river blindness, trachoma, has just plunged, partly because of the incredible work of former President Carter. So there, you know, I think that those of us who care deeply about humanitarian issues have to acknowledge that progress, if only to make people understand that it's not hopeless, that we can genuinely make progress and then use that in turn to stimulate us to try to go a little further, do a little more, make a little more difference.
Well, your life is certainly a testament to all of that. Nicholas Kristof, I like to end on a positive note in the Solutions Studio, so thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure.